Let's bring in Sean Payton, the Coach of the Year, a Super Bowl champ, 9 years, 15 playoffs. We've been bringing him on Mondays. It's been an absolute joy for us. So I was watching the game last night, and I be the first to admit, the game is so offensive now. Most games are up in the 20s.
Sure.
But I found so much value in it. Like, let's start with the Niners. My takeaway was, this was the first week in 8 months that Garoppolo got every snap at practice. I think San Francisco's going to be fine.
Yeah, I do too. That's who I would pick right now, I think, after 3 games.
To win the NFC?
To win the NFC West.
Okay.
And look, there were a handful of those games this past weekend. I feel like there's been 2 or 3 where you're watching and you're saying, well, they're missing a lot of their weapons. They're hurt.
Yeah.
And even with Green Bay, I mean, he misses Adams.
Oh, there's no – they miss each other.
Yes,
no
both of them.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where you don't realize, how good things – that was the best 1-2 punch, quarterback-receiver tandem.
In the league.
In the league for the last 3 years. And there was a gap between 1 and 2.
Right.
And all of a sudden, that was broken up.
This is an interesting thing, and I said this. All wins feel good. But there are losses that you can live with. Buffalo, you had the ball 40 minutes.
Yeah.
And then there are wins that I'd get on that flight home, and I'd look at my staff and go, we got a little issue. Green Bay, 3 games, can't score in the second half. My takeaway is Aaron loses trust really quickly with these young guys, and if they drop a pass or there's a fumble, after that fumble, 7 of the next 8 drives, 3 plays punt. Is that this offense with these kids needs patience?
Well, look, if you're there and you're Aaron or you're coaching there, it just means, hey, there's nothing better than a win, and we have work to do. If you're the head coach.
Right.
We won, but clearly we can put the tape on. We have work to do, as opposed to we did everything right, and I've got to really worry about this team being overconfident going into next week's game. So we won, and it's a real good win. Because I didn't see that win for them. I saw Tampa Bay's defense being a tough matchup. And quite honestly, I thought Green Bay did a good job in the first 2 or 3 series. They moved the ball, and what was amazing is they gave you the yards per pass, and then the yards after the catch, the yak was like 170 yards. In other words, all the passes were going to the flats or intermediate areas of the field, but they were advancing the ball with run after the catch. But when you follow up a game like that and you're able to go back and say, hey, in order for us to get where we want to go, we have a lot more work to do. And I think there are a number of teams like that right now that you're kind of looking at and saying, we remember last year a little bit with some of these teams, and there's been some shuffling of skill players, injuries, whatnot.
Well, yeah, Sean, look at this. People aren't playing in the preseason. A lot of soft tissue injuries.
Yeah.
Buffalo's beat up.
Yep.
I honestly think this is that most of the players that are hurt will return, but you no longer hit. And so
right.
the Spurs, I mean, that's what it looks like to me.
No, you're exactly right. And look, the data, they can play with that however they want to, but we're seeing more of that in
not season-ending stuff.
No, just like Julio Jones. I think I'm just going to say he's questionable the rest of the year. The last 3 seasons, he's been questionable every week. So I don't need to see that on the ticker anymore.
Yeah. So let's go to let's go back to San Francisco, Denver. So you are a very strong-willed person, and you and Breeze formed over the last 7-8 years like a real bond, like a you may never have a bond like that with a quarterback the rest of your life.
Sure.
And he certainly won't.
Sure.
But it takes time. Your first year, you're trying to figure out what can he do, what can he, and you're strong-willed, and he's like, man, this coach has got a point of view, and Drew is. And so Hackett's known as a nice guy, and Russell wants to be a good soldier, and they come together, and Russell doesn't, he kind of is, all right, we'll do some of your stuff. And then the coach is like, well, he's a star, he just made $300 million. And I felt like until the last drive, they were feeling each other out, and Russell finally last night said, I'm just going to go do my thing. I'm just going to run around like I did for 10 years because I feel like this is harder than people think. That first 6 games together with a new guy.
Yeah, and when you take a player who's been with one organization 12 years or 13 years and at the quarterback position, so he's probably had a couple offenses, a few offensive coordinators, they've made changes, whether or not they change the verbiage or terminology, who knows. But then when he arrives somewhere else and it's a new team, new ownership, they bring in a new head coach. I mean, everything there is new. And so the only stability you'd say would be Payton, the GM. That's in place.
Yeah.
And man, getting up to speed and on the same page and I remember this, and this was unique. When we got to New Orleans, Breeze was still a Charger. Mm-hmm. We were at the Combine. It was February. We had the second pick of the draft. So a lot of our focus was on the quarterbacks. How can we find a quarterback? We knew we were in that market. And, we were looking at Josh McCown. We were looking at a number of veterans, and we got word that the Chargers had released Drew. He had the shoulder surgery.
Yeah.
And the hardest part was it was such an unusual injury. There was no history. There wasn't one example of a quarterback who had a fully torn rotator and that came back and played. All right. We made the decision to bring Drew on board, and it just so happened months prior to that, I had hired the Chargers quality control coach, Pete Carmichael, who's now the offensive coordinator. Pete had insight as to this is what we called certain things. And so immediately when we signed Breeze, because we're all gathering, putting the offense together, this is our first year.
Denver's doing.
We began to put together terms he knew, systems he knew, things that were familiar to him, just to bridge that gap, just to make it a little bit smoother.
Sure.
And so I don't know how much Hackett and Russell had talked in the offseason relative to cadence, huddle. This is how we call formations. But I think it's not a bad idea especially when you're getting a veteran player like Russell Wilson. I was always a little leery of this acquisition.
How come?
I think going into year 13, I think it was more the compensation. I think it's a lot for a player going into his 13th year. I think it's a lot of compensation.
Oh.
But we're selling a dream.
That's a good point.
And we're selling a team. And so it's a more attractive team with a franchise quarterback on it than it was.
Going to get more money from that ownership group.
Yeah. It's certainly more attractive when that's in place.
Sure. No, that's really important. And I think it's great to go back with Breeze because I think there's some limitations to here. If Russell doesn't run, he's not the same player. It's like Kyler Murray now has decided, I don't want to run. Well, you're not the same quarterback.
Yeah, those off-schedule plays, Russell especially, gosh, the thing that he would give you fits with is, flush the pocket, and a normal quarterback would gain 3 yards, he'd gain 8. It'd be 2nd and 3. Or it's that scramble, that crazy pull-up, and that ball that traveled 60 yards in the air. He did that better than anyone.
Yeah.
And then with Kyler, obviously, he's a little different that way. I mean, but Russell became good enough to beat you in the pocket as well. And I think you mentioned a player earlier. I felt like in the last 14 days, we've seen this quarterback at Philly, Jalen Hurts.
What do you make of
it? Listen, I would agree 100% with what you said. I liked him. I thought he was a good player, but we've seen him come into his own, his coming out party, if you will. And people talk about confidence. It comes only, and it's only born from demonstrated ability. And in the last 2 weeks, we've seen his step, like leaps and bounds, become thrown into the discussion of one of the top players or someone who's potentially an MVP of our league, and you would have never thought about that 2 years ago.
By the way, the front office deserves credit. Howie Roseman took some big swings.
No question. I was in New York as a coordinator, and we had played the Eagles well for years, and they had a young quarterback, Donovan McNabb, who had struggled beating the Giants. And on a Monday night in New York, he finally, in a 2-minute drill, took his team back against us and won the game. And I would say, I always remember saying that was a growth moment that night for him. And I feel like the last 2 games that we've seen Jalen play, particularly two weeks ago, the Minnesota game, where it was like, holy cow. It was so impressive, and we all looked at it and said, it's happening right now. So when someone says, hey, when did he become – it's happening right now in front of our eyes.
Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it is.
So yesterday with the Raiders, and I think they have some roster issues. They have some really nice high-end pieces. Darren Waller's a terrific player.
Sure.
I think Colton Miller's a good left tackle. Hunter Renfrow, obviously Devontae Adams, but he's brand new. I like Derek Carr more than most. And they have some edge rushers. Max Crosby's terrific. But the roster, I think, has some holes in it. But yesterday after a loss, the owner they have a long meeting with the owner and the coach, Josh McDaniels. What am I supposed to read into that?
Well, it is what it is. When the boss wants to see you, it probably means there's some problems. I think the first thing I think about, because I interviewed with the owner's father, Al Davis, on 2 different occasions. Thank God he doesn't have to meet with Al Davis, because Al knew everything about defensive football. He knew fronts, he knew coverages, he knew offensive packages. He was the one owner in this league that could interview you on personnel. Like he was a coach at one point, a general manager, a commissioner of a league, and then owner of a team. And so it wasn't just how's your family, what do you believe in relative to your philosophy in the offseason. It was much more in depth. He wanted to draw front and coverage, put it up on the grease board, and then just talk football. So that meeting for Josh, those are never fun. All right, regardless of what industry you're in,
boss calls.
Yeah, well, it's the meeting where your mom says, "Wait till your dad gets home." It's the same meeting. You sit in your room and you just dread the door closing. But it would have been a lot more difficult meeting. And I with all respect to Mark, and Mark's a tremendous guy and someone that I know. Look, they were just in the playoffs. And he had to make a tough decision, by the way. Mark, there was a sentiment to keep the status quo with the job Rich had done and, replacing John Gruden during the year.
Yeah.
And so that's a tough decision. And you make that decision and you kind of clean house a little bit, general manager, head coach, and no one wants to be sitting there 0-3. So Dad came home last night.
So Eric Bieniemy and Mahomes had a moment. Bieniemy's known. He was a player. He was a great player in college, and he's an intense guy, intimidating, and he'll howl a little bit. He can be loud. That's his reputation. He's intense. And Mahomes, he's got a strong point of view. When you see this, should I be concerned?
No, look, they're 2-1. They've got this level of expectation. They believe they should win every game. Was that coming off the end of the half?
Yes.
And was it a situation where
Mahomes wanted to go for it, and Bieniemy was like, let's just get to the locker room?
But I think Mahomes probably was looking at, why aren't we throwing one Hail Mary to the end zone?
Yeah.
Like, in other words,
yeah.
And quite honestly, it's a good question.
Right.
Like there's times where if you can't get it to the end zone, all right, let's take the knee but no, that kind of stuff happens. Believe it or not, a lot more happens than you think, and we only capture a little bit of it.
So, Sean, that's what I said with the Ken Dorsey reaction. I said, folks, we didn't have cameras in there 10 years ago. I've sat next to coaching upstairs twice, 3 times in my life, and heard the screaming during the game. So when Ken Dorsey becomes unraveled, my takeaway is you're just getting access to it now.
The Ken Dorsey clip is fabulous because I look at that, and the first thing that comes to my mind is the hours someone puts in. Right, we talked about it. That's part of the job, all right? And so when all of that goes into a game plan and you're close, and maybe it's a red zone play and a guy doesn't do the right thing or doesn't run the right route and it's fabulous. Nothing gets broken. There's no tablet. Maybe the computer.
Brady's out there breaking tablets.
Yeah, he's breaking tablets. But no, this is that's authentic at least. And yeah,
it happens.
Here's the thing, though. The funny thing is that the camera's there now, and there's only going to be more cameras. And they don't ask. They say this is our enhancement this year to our media policy, and so. I can recall when they asked me to put a camera in our booth in a game in 2011. I'd fractured my leg on a play that came into the sidelines, and I said, "Sure, put the camera in there, but just let's not, overdo it." And they caught a glimpse of me eating a hot dog at halftime because we were up 50 points against the Colts. But the worst part about it is they threw it in the fourth quarter and acted like I was doing it live. Like that's how. And so. Look, the cameras are in the locker room. They're now in the press box, and pretty soon, you're going to have guests on the sidelines. You're going to turn and look, and there's going to be a sponsor there. That was good, though. I got a kick out of watching that because that was actual frustration.
And by the way, he's not hurting anybody. He's among other coaches. And so I always say this to the media: if you want access, then get over your feelings because your careers end
100%.
So we can't ask for access as the media and then be offended by how you act.
Right. I thought I didn't think a whole lot, honestly, of Mahomes and Bieniemy and Andy. That I'm sure it was something that, hey, now more frustrating is that they just lost to the Colts.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for watching. Subscribe here to get the latest from the show. Also, be sure to check out more of the best clips from The Herd or go watch a few segments from other shows on FS1.